Hey, Herdwatching, or herd watchers, I guess you guys would be. My name is Ken, and I am coming to you from the U.S. East Coast. It's probably, 3 o'clock in the morning right now on December 27th, a couple of days after Christmas. And we're going to be talking about foreign policy, Obama, Trump, in particular, as it rolls around the topic of Israel. Now, anytime you talk about Israel, you're going to get an enormous amount of abuse and trolling, and people are going to come in and whatever. Feel free to comment. Make reasonable arguments if you can about my opinions. I'm happy to learn stuff all the time. But frankly, I'm not going to deal with too much zealotry on this topic. So in order to really understand how the current situation with Barack Obama's foreign policy and Donald Trump's foreign policy and the actions of the UN, we have to sort of do a pocket history of two things we're talking about. One, the Israeli state as a whole, and two, the way the UN Security Council works. So let's dive into that. Now, right now, and hyper-simplifying a very complicated situation, the nation of Israel exists on some land, and at a time in the relatively recent past, a whole bunch of people around them decided that they didn't want them to be there anymore and attempted to eradicate the nation. As a result of that conflict, the Israelis, who won, pushed their borders outward to create a buffer zone, a security space, so that they wouldn't get caught quite that way again. There are other aspects to this, but this is sort of the key point in my mind on this. So now there is obviously a significant amount of conflict over whether this was the right answer, whether this is the right answer, whether there's an ethical and moral right for someone who is being attacked, that when they successfully repulse that attack, what rights does that confer on them to maybe expand their sphere of influence so that they're not attacked again by the same people? And what do you get to keep from the people that attacked you? Let's say we're talking right now and my next door neighbors get together and they come into my house and try and murder me and my family. I don't think that I ethically necessarily have to just throw them out of my house and then stop at the edge of my property and go, well, I certainly can't pursue you into your house. That would be wrong. I'm not really down with that. I would enter into their house. I would take their big screen TV. I would keep all their stuff that I like, and then I would continue to occupy that house and push them back to the next block, because quite frankly, I'm not really in the mood to go to bed anymore with people 15 feet away from me, just sort of buying their time and sharpening their knives to come back and get me again. Screw that noise. I'm pushing you as far back as I can manage, and then I'm going to install stuff in that space, in that buffer zone. Maybe people, maybe allies, maybe my people, maybe family members of mine. We're going to fortify that space and we're going to push you back out. And basically, that's what happened with Israel. Now, there are people living in that space, that occupied zone now, or the immediately surrounding area, who are not thrilled by this. They, for the most part, don't think that Israel should exist at all, let alone that Israel should be building neighborhoods next to them and whatever. And for this reason, again, that was simplified, but for this reason, there's a lot of conflict in the area. But honestly, that's not really where the conflict really comes from. The specific argument about that particular war and who took over what piece of land, look, it's not like nations haven't managed to resolve occupying territory in the past. So more to the point, there are a lot of powers in the Middle East that are simply deeply unhappy with Israel existing as a whole for religious reasons. They're deeply unhappy with the Jewish people existing, period, and certainly existing as a independent nation with a significant military force of their own, sort of right in the Middle Eastern territories. It's a tremendous thorn in their side and this tremendous insult to them, both religious, in a religious way, they're very unhappy about it. In a personal animosity way, they're very unhappy about it. And then from a strategic standpoint, Israel represents the best platform for keeping an eye on and projecting power into the Middle East in that area. Were Israel to fall, it becomes enormously easier for sort of extremist Middle Eastern governments and the terrorist organizations that they support. It becomes infinitely easier for them to sort of gather their forces to project power into the West with no one keeping an eye on them. You may think it's easy to keep an eye on everywhere from everywhere in the world, but it's really not. In the end, you have to have people on the ground, and some of the best people on the ground in the world come from Israel out into the rest of the Middle East, and we get an enormous amount of information and intelligence from that. So on every level, to me, it makes perfect sense for the U.S. to have a huge investment in Israel. Not only, first, ethically and morally. The U.S. should be supporting free democracies of governments, free democracies of people who are dedicated to Western ideals, which is, personal freedom, capitalism, and these things. I happen to think that those things are not only economically viable, I happen to think they are morally correct. And as a result, those governments that support them are my allies because they are also, in my mind, morally correct. So, and let's skip, Jewish persecution through history and all the rest of that, which to me is also really valid. But just the existence of Israel, regardless of its history, that free government, I find morally and ethically valuable. Strategically, it's incredibly important for us that Israel exists for the reasons we talked about a second ago. And then tactically, let's be hyper practical about it. There's an enormous amount of firepower and suicide bombers and all sorts of energy that's directed at Israel that's not being put on a boat and directed at us tactically. So we have a strategic advantage in the Middle East, we have a tactical advantage, we have a moral and ethical advantage in Israel existing. This has been obvious to U.S. presidents for decades, for as long as Israel's been around. For the most part, the United States has realized that we are allies. We're natural allies. So that's Israel in a nutshell. Let's jump for just one moment and talk about this idea of part of the argument for Israel or against the Israeli sort of expansion. You'll hear people talk all the time about this sort of idea that it's not their land, that they're taking over land that's not theirs, as if it is possible to put a pin in a moment in history and decide who owns a piece of land. Now, that's not to say that we can't have a reasonable discussion of the morals and ethics of any particular conflict and any particular colonization. I'm not saying that all colonization is inherently ethical and moral. I'm certainly not, I wasn't a fan of the way Germany tried to acquire France and so on during World War II. That's not my point. My point is that any place in history you put a pin in the ground and say, this group of people is the natural owner of this bit of history, I can just move that pin back 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, or 1,000 years, and it turns out somebody else owned that piece of land, and your natural owners are really just people that conquered that land just a little bit further back. So again, there's a lot to be said, and there are arguments to be had and discussions to be had about whether any particular expansion or takeover or a piece of land is moral and ethical, but none of them, in my mind, hinge on your arbitrary selection of a point in history of who the natural owners of a piece of land are. And this goes for America, this goes for the Middle East, this goes for most of Europe. In America, you see this sort of thing come up a lot when we're talking about Native American issues. And again, there's a lot of those to be had. There's a lot of discussion that's reasonable there. But none of that, to me, hinges on the idea that you're deciding that on this particular year, this particular tribe was the owner of this piece of land, and that now we have a moral obligation to them have that land because they're the natural owners of it, when 5 years before that they acquired that piece of land from another tribe by beating their heads in with sticks. And 20 years from that, earlier than that, it was another tribe that owned that piece of land. So this idea of natural ownership of land is not it. There's a lot to be talked about in the ethics of any particular conquest or transfer or conflict, but not in the sense of natural ownership and natural law. Okay, so that's Israel in a nutshell. Now, there's this thing called the UN in the world. Most of you have probably heard of it. I happen to think it's a necessary appendage, like an appendix. I don't know, I suppose, it's useful to have this sort of drama stage for world politics to play out on. We have to all get together and talk somewhere. We might as well talk at a place with a lot of flags where we pretend it matters. But in the end, the UN suffers from the same problems that we saw that we see in the EU, that we see in a lot of these places. Governments are already removed from the will of the people and the consequences of their actions. State level governments, as in nation state level governments, are massively removed. And when governments get together and form a sort of a meta government, you just get this insanity where now you have these career insider politicians, sort of this politically incestuous world where they all just get together sort of in the middle of nowhere, completely insulated from the populace that they're affecting, and they sort of pass their resolutions and do their things. Fortunately, the UN is basically toothless and very, very rarely has the ability to project the force required to back up their thoughts. Now, when the UN does project force, they threw it through something called the Security Council. And the UN Security Council has 5 permanent members, including the United States, including the Soviet Union, and France and Great Britain, that sort of thing. Oh, and Germany, I think, might be the last one. Anyway, there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council. There are a number of non-permanent members of the Security Council. And the UN Security Council, in theory, gets together and makes decisions of where the UN is going to project force. Now, the UN doesn't have a standing military of its own. It's the contribution of the member states. Interestingly enough, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council were also the 5 member states that would have had to contribute the majority of the military. If any of those 5 states, as constituted in the UN Charter, if any of those states veto a military action, then that resolution fails the UN Security Council. So there can be, and I think in 2015 there were like 15 states, so the 5 permanent and 10 non-permanent members. It could go 14-1, but if the Soviet Union says no, then the answer is no. If the United States says no, the answer is no. And this is important. This is a critical thing, because none of these 5 powers would have signed into the UN if the United States would have never signed onto the UN Charter if we thought that the UN Security Council would vote against us and then send military forces into the United States that included equipment and men provided by the United States, and money that we had sent them was funding it. It was just never going to happen. So the UN Security Council simply allows us to veto these things, or the Soviet Union to veto them, instead of it passing and then us having a shooting war about it. Very pragmatic, and I'm actually kind of impressed about how they came up with it. But if a UN Security Council member abstains, remember I said they have to vote against a resolution, then that's not a veto, that's not an abstention. So recently, it came to the UN Security Council, a resolution that has the effect, though the language is a little tricky, but the effect is condemnation of the Israeli expansion, and sort of really sort of puts the screws to Israel on the world stage and sets in motion an enormous number of sanctions and bills. And again, a resolution against you in the UN Security Council has real implications for your security, for your economy, for the way you deal with the world around you. And since the inception of Israel, these sort of resolutions come up a lot. The UN is staggeringly anti-Israel, as you would imagine, because there are hundreds of nations involved, and the vast majority of them are sort of extremists in one way or the other, and so they're trying to pass all sorts of stupid resolutions all the time, and Israel's the target of a fair number of them. And every single time it's come up in the Security Council, the United States has voted no. Every single time we have their back. Until now. Barack Obama personally involved himself in the decision to instruct the U.S. representative to the Security Council to abstain in the latest vote. As a result of that abstention, the measure passed, and we allowed the UN to sort of jam a knife, or certainly get very close to jamming a knife into Israel politically. And it's just insanity. It's ridiculous. Look, you're welcome to make arguments with me about maybe you have an opinion that Israel's not an important ally to the U.S. Maybe you have an opinion that it's too much money for nothing. Whatever, talk to me about it if you want. I don't think you're going to convince me, but I'm happy to do it. But when we're actually looking at the actions of Barack Obama, you're looking at a guy who has not been a massive friend of Israel, but has always been a pragmatist about it. At least he's hidden his sort of anti-Israeli sentiment and nominally continued this special relationship we have with them until now. So why now, with less than, a month left in office, does Barack Obama step up and do something that's unprecedented in the history of U.S. Middle Eastern relationships? Is it because he has wanted to do this all along, and he genuinely feels that, Israel is a bad deal as an ally for the United States, and that now that he won't have to face the repercussions politically of this, he can finally be honest about it? Maybe. Though that would be a fairly principled stance, and Obama doesn't strike me as a particularly principled person. He has to know that this is a massive blowback to his legacy, and along with his defense of Hillary Clinton, is going to define his presidency, in my mind, as one of catastrophic failure. Or is it that he has traded for other agenda items with some of the states that proposed those bills, and he's making some UN deals, and he just doesn't care what happens to Israel on this? Or is it, as is both likely and horrible, given some of his other actions, that he is simply attempting to make it as difficult as possible for Donald Trump to have a successful foreign policy? Possibly not because he hopes for the presidency to fail, but because he wants to keep Trump so busy for the first year that Trump can't repeal Obamacare and do some of the other things he's promised to do, so that then Obama can stay around on the sidelines and make political advantage out of that failure. God, I hope not. I think the idea that an outgoing president would deliberately sabotage foreign policy on something so incredibly important as our primary bulwark against this extreme Islamic extremists and terrorism, that he would materially weaken the security of not only Israel as a nation, but then as a follow-on effect, every nation in the West that's facing an influx of terrorism, that he would do that in service of a personal political goal, of avarice, a partisan political goal at that. That would be mind-blowing. I don't put it past him. He certainly has made some pretty horrific decisions in my mind, but this would be special. This is going to be one of those decisions where, even though Trump can come in and sort of patch it up and whatever, that resolution is never going away, and that moment of fear and that moment of betrayal will never be erased. We can hope that Trump manages to reach out to the Israeli government, and that they recognize, as it looks like they might, that this was the sort of spasmodic last move of an outgoing president that's becoming more and more irrelevant in foreign policy circles as time goes on. Because let's face it, since the election, Donald Trump has been deriving U.S. foreign policy. He's been using Twitter and having more influence on international relations than Barack Obama has managed to have in a while. So hopefully Trump can come in and kind of patch that back together. But man, what an astounding turn of events. And I think it's easy for people to underestimate how shocking this must have been in a lot of circles, and how dangerous it really can be. So yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, look, we have other foreign policy things that are happening as well that Obama is sort of doing, and domestically he's collapsing programs that have existed for years and years. For one, there's stuff on the books from 9/11 about sort of tracking the incoming and outgoing movements of temporary visa holders and immigrants. So Obama collapsed this program because it would have been a little too politically easy for Trump to simply, use the laws that were on the books and the program that was already there, even though it was dormant, and use it as part of his immigration policy. And I know for a fact that Obama and the Democrats want him to have to start from scratch on that stuff. And that's the sort of like annoying pettiness that I think is going to define this transition. And it's ridiculous. Now, why though? Why would Obama go to the trouble of putting these landsmines in place? Why would he do this in a way that previous presidents have not? Well, in one sense, our partisan politics have gotten more contentious, and certainly that's true. But in another sense, Barack Obama is unique in another way. It doesn't look like he's going to fade into the background. I mentioned this on my vlog. It's very common for U.S. presidents. They stay in the public eye. They open hospitals and write books, and they go on shows and talk about their time as president. But we have a long tradition where existing presidents, sitting presidents, are free from minute-to-minute back seat driving and political abuse by past presidents. They just sort of step off the stage. And you'll hear it time and time again. You'll hear President Bush has been asked over the last 8 years all the time. And he just never comments specifically on Barack Obama's actions. He may talk about his feelings on a particular issue, but he never goes, look, that guy's doing a horrible thing, or I think he's making a bad call. He always just says, the office is difficult, and I'm not going to comment on the specific actions of a sitting president. But Obama has already indicated in a number of ways that he's not planning on fading off into the sidelines, that he's planning on staying and actively being a political campaigner, commentator, critic, and speaking out in a way that's not common. Now, is it his right to do so? Sure. And when Trump leaves office, if somebody else gets in, do I support Trump doing it? Were there times when I wished George Bush would do it? Have spoken out about Barack Obama? Sure. I don't necessarily know that I agree with that, like we don't talk about it kind of thing. But that said, that is the tradition. But now Barack Obama is going to break that tradition. And that does give an incentive to him, a unique incentive to him, to sort of muddy and roil the waters in a way, because now he stands to directly gain politically from the sort of fallout. And I will not be shocked. I don't expect it, but I won't be shocked if it turns out Obama is eyeing coming back for another term, or if he's going to take on the leadership of the Democratic Party and handpick his successor who's going to run against Trump in 2020. I fully expect to see Obama on TV and making speeches and actively being a partisan force of criticism. Again, I support his right to do it. I'm not telling him to shut up. I'm not saying it's unpatriotic. I'm saying it's unique in the history of recent history of the nation, certainly, and that we have to take into account his intention to do that when we look at his actions right now. We need to add that to the lens that we're using to evaluate how he's acting. So, what's the sort of 5-second bullet point here? You've been with me for 23 minutes. Israel is awesome. The UN is functionally irrelevant. I can't tell whether Obama is naive, mean, or actively acting against the interest of the incoming administration. Natural rights to land are kind of an iffy subject on a historical timescale, and Obama's not going away anytime soon, so we're going to be dealing with this guy for a while. I guess he's going back to community organizing, which will be a thrill for everyone concerned. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Herdwatching. I'm sort of kind of going with this rant format. When we started, we'd been sort of targeting 9 or 10 minute videos because I read somewhere that they do better. But honestly, it looks like 2024 is kind of our sweet spot. I like being able to talk to you guys about the things that are in my head, and I like being able to take a little more time to do it. I hope you continue to enjoy it. Please remember to like and subscribe on YouTube, and like and subscribe on Herdwatching, or like and follow on Facebook. Share it with your friends. If you're in any political Facebook groups that might not see these posts, go ahead and share those videos. If you happen to know anybody who you might want to, anybody in the media, feel free to share them that way. Otherwise, I'm going to keep making them anyway. We'll talk next time about the upcoming release of Anthem. We have to have a conversation about Ayn Rand anyway. All right, guys, take it easy.